The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana plains, chasing dry leaves and dust through fields long abandoned by summer. A woman moved slowly along a narrow trail carved into the earth by wagon wheels and desperation. Her dress was torn, streaked with mud and soot. Her boots had holes in the soles, and each step was a testament to endurance. Beside her, a small girl no older than 5 clutched her hand, one arm wrapped around a headless cloth doll whose body was as stained as the child's cheeks. Caroline Winters had not cried since she'd buried her husband 4 nights ago. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with Ruthie Mae watching her every move. The girl hadn't spoken since the moment they heaped dirt over his shivering body near the overturned wagon. Caroline hadn't forced her. She understood the kind of pain that robs sound from a throat. Each mile behind them was a blur of frostbitten silence and aching muscles. She carried nothing now but a threadbare blanket, a pocket knife, and a letter. The letter was creased at the corners, soaked once with tears, once with rain, and once with blood, none of it her own. Scrawled in fading ink across the top was a name, Thomas Granger. Beneath it, the words, "If you ever lose everything, come find me. There's a place for you here." She wasn't sure if he'd meant it. She wasn't even sure he'd remember her name, let alone her husband's. But it was all she had left. The world behind her was empty. Ahead, just over the hill, was the last place she could call hope. Ruthie stumbled. Caroline steadied her quickly, kneeling to check the child's cracked, reddened hands. Her fingers were like little twigs, brittle and cold. "Just a bit more, baby," Caroline whispered. "See that light? That's where we're going." Far off through the trees, a lantern flickered against the violet dusk. A wooden house, square and quiet, stood in the valley, its edges softened by snow flurries and gathering fog. A wind vane creaked on the roof. No smoke rose from the chimney. Caroline's stomach twisted. What if he wasn't there? What if he turned them away? But there was no time for questions now, no room for fear. She scooped Ruthie into her arms and trudged the final stretch. The child weighed little more than the bundle of rags she wore. When they reached the fence line, Caroline stopped. Her breath came in ragged clouds. Her legs trembled with fatigue. Ruthie clung to her coat as if afraid the wind might steal them both away. On the porch, the silhouette of a man stood still beneath the overhang, watching. Thomas Granger had the look of someone who'd once known war and had not found peace since. He was tall and lean, his beard salted with gray, his shoulders broad beneath a worn leather duster. His rifle rested casually against the doorway, though his eyes, clear and hard beneath the brim of his hat, were anything but casual. Caroline took a deep breath. She stepped forward slowly, feeling the full weight of every mile she'd carried, every loss she'd buried. "My daddy died today," she said, voice tight, barely above the wind. Can we sleep in your barn?" Ruthie looked up at the man, her face hollow with exhaustion. She didn't speak, only pressed her cheek against her mother's shoulder. Granger didn't move. Not at first. The wind filled the silence between them like a warning. Then he stepped down from the porch, slowly, each footfall deliberate. Caroline stood firm, though her knees buckled with cold. She couldn't afford pride, but she would not beg. "No, ma'am," Granger said at last. Her throat tightened. She turned slightly, shielding Ruthie as if preparing for another long night in the wild. But then he said, softer now, "Not in the barn." Caroline looked up. "You're sleeping inside," Granger added. "Both of you." His voice wasn't warm. Not exactly. But there was something in it, something real, something safe. She stared at him, unsure whether to trust the words. She'd been burned before by men who offered kindness with one hand and cruelty with the other. But she nodded. Granger opened the door and stepped aside. Yellow light spilled from inside, lamplight, the smell of wood smoke, something cooking on the stove. "Come on in," he said, voice a low rumble. "You're home now." She stepped through the doorway, Ruthie still wrapped in her arms. The cabin was simple. A fireplace crackled in one corner, next to a pinewood table set with 2 tin mugs and a half-finished plate of venison. A kettle steamed quietly on the stove. Caroline lowered Ruthie to a chair near the fire. The child didn't speak, but the way her eyes softened said everything. Granger hung his rifle by the door and removed his hat. He didn't smile, not quite, but the harsh lines of his face eased. "I'll get blankets," he said. She nodded again, finding no words. Her throat was thick with something she hadn't felt in days, relief. As he moved into the back room, Caroline sat beside her daughter and tucked the blanket over her thin legs. Her hands trembled, whether from cold or something deeper she didn't know. She had arrived with nothing. And yet, here they were. Ruthie leaned against her side, eyes fluttering shut. Caroline looked around the room. It was quiet, spare, but cared for. There were no pictures on the wall, no tokens of joy, but there was no dust on the table either. Whoever Thomas Granger was, he hadn't let the world rot him entirely. He returned with bedding and a thick flannel coat. Caroline rose to help him prepare the couch. "You don't have to," he said, gently taking the blanket from her hands. "You've done enough for one lifetime." She looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but the absence of fear. A shared understanding. He laid the blanket down and gestured. "She can sleep here. You take the cot in the room." "I'm not taking your bed." "You're not taking it," he said, shrugging. "I'm giving it." She hesitated, then nodded. When Ruthie was tucked in and the fire dimmed to embers, Caroline lingered in the doorway to the back room. "Thank you," she said. The words felt strange on her lips, fragile and unfinished. Granger nodded once. "Like I said. You're home now." She stepped inside and closed the door. Outside, the wind began to calm. Snow fell quietly onto the roof. And for the first time in days, the night held no wolves. But it did hold questions. Who was this man who welcomed strangers without asking for names? What sorrow lay behind his silence? And more importantly, was this truly a beginning, or just a pause between storms? Caroline didn't have the answers. But sleep found her anyway. Dawn crept slowly over the Montana horizon, pale light filtering through the frost-rimmed windows of the cabin. The fire in the hearth had reduced to glowing coals, casting long, sleepy shadows across the floor. Caroline stirred first. For a moment she didn't move. Her eyes drifted along the ceiling beams, unsure of where she was. Then the scent of smoke and pine, the gentle crackle, and the soft breathing of her daughter pulled her back from the edge of dreams. Ruthie lay curled on the couch, her tiny hands tucked beneath her chin. Her lips moved silently in sleep, maybe whispering to ghosts only children still believed in. Caroline leaned over, brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek, and kissed her forehead. Granger was already outside. Through the frost-patterned window, Caroline saw him by the woodpile, splitting logs with efficient, practiced strikes. He worked like a man who'd done it 1,000 times, not out of ritual but because survival demanded it. His movements were quiet, purposeful, and solitary. She found a kettle and poured water into the tin pot, placing it gently over the fire to warm. She didn't want to overstep, but doing nothing felt more foreign than acting. Ruthie stirred as the warmth returned to the room, blinking into the dim light. "Good morning," Caroline said softly. The little girl nodded, still not speaking. She looked around, momentarily confused. Then she saw the cabin, the hearth, the quiet safety of a roof overhead, and her eyes relaxed. Caroline watched the change in her closely. It was the first sign of peace she'd seen in days. Granger entered a few minutes later, boots wet with dew, arms full of split logs. He dropped them beside the fireplace and removed his coat, nodding toward the warming kettle. "You found the pot," he said. "I hope you don't mind. It's there to be used." Caroline poured hot water into the mug she'd found, dropping a few dried leaves from a tin labeled tea in careful scoops. "Thank you," she said again. "For last night. For letting us stay." Granger gave a short nod. "Storm's coming in tonight. You picked a good time to arrive." Caroline sipped her tea in silence. She wanted to ask questions, wanted to know who he'd become since the war, if he still remembered her husband, if he lived alone by choice or by pain, but something told her those questions would have to wait. Granger wasn't the kind of man you pressed. Instead, she offered what she could. "I'll work," she said, setting the mug down. "You don't need to feed us for free. I can cook, sew, chop wood if I have to. I know how to be useful." "I don't need anything," he replied, his voice quiet but even. "But I won't stop you." The words were not unkind. They were simple, honest, like everything about him. Caroline looked down at Ruthie, who had now climbed into her lap and rested her head against her chest. "She hasn't spoken since the burial," she said. Granger didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. His eyes flicked toward Ruthie with something like recognition. "I buried my son under that cottonwood yonder," he said, almost absent-mindedly. "Fever took him 3 winters ago." Caroline blinked, unsure what to say. "My wife died the winter before," he continued. "Complications from childbirth. It was a hard few years." He didn't say it for sympathy. He spoke the way some men breathe, without thought, just survival. "I'm sorry," she said. Granger nodded again. "We all carry something." The words settled over the room like dust, quiet and final. The day passed slowly. Caroline swept the cabin while Ruthie sat outside beneath the low sun, stacking kindling with quiet concentration. Granger didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice was calm, sure. He showed her how to close the flue in the chimney when the wind turned, and where he kept his root vegetables, wrapped in burlap sacks under the floorboards. There was a rhythm to life here, a quiet, tireless heartbeat, steady and firm. Caroline found herself drawn to it. In the absence of chaos, the silence seemed to invite reflection. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind slate-colored clouds, Granger returned from the far pasture with a worried crease in his brow. "Snow tonight," he said, tightening the rope on the barn door. "Heavy." Caroline helped him cover the chicken coop, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, hands raw from the cold. When their fingers met on the rope, she felt a moment of heat, startling, human, real. He looked at her but said nothing. Later, while Ruthie ate soup by the fire, Granger stood by the window, watching the first flakes drift down like ashes. Caroline moved beside him, arms crossed tightly. "She trusts you," she said, eyes on Ruthie. "It's strange. She's usually slow to warm to people." "She's smart," he said. "She sees what's true." His words struck something in her, a chord not often touched. She wasn't used to being seen. Not really. Her husband had loved her, yes, but through the veil of his own dreams, his own ambitions. With Granger, there was no performance, no flattery, just observation. She turned toward him, her eyes meeting his. For a moment there was something between them. Not longing, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. "Why'd you write that letter?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Your husband saved my life," he said. "Near Franklin, Tennessee. I was bleeding out in a ravine. He dragged me to safety, sewed me up with his own hands. I promised him, if he ever needed anything." Caroline exhaled. Her husband had never spoken of it. "I didn't think you'd come," Granger added. "I didn't think I would either," she said, more to herself than to him. Then everything fell apart. Granger nodded. He didn't press her to continue. He simply turned back to the window and watched as snow swallowed the earth outside. When Caroline went to check on Ruthie, she found the girl asleep with her doll, curled up like a kitten. She paused, watching her daughter breathe. It was the first time she hadn't feared the night. She returned to the fireplace. Granger was still there, stoking the embers. "You can sleep in the bed again tonight," he said. "I'll take the floor." "No," she replied, firm but gentle. "We'll switch." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not made of porcelain," she said. "Besides, Ruthie might stir." He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. The two of them stood in silence for a while. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling against the logs. Snow battered the shutters. But inside, there was warmth and wood smoke and the scent of pine. It wasn't home. Not yet. But it could be. As she turned in for the night, Caroline paused in the doorway of the back room. Granger was laying out a blanket by the hearth, one hand resting near the butt of the rifle beside him. "Good night, Thomas," she said, surprising herself by using his name for the first time. He looked up at her, eyes steady. "Good night, Caroline." Then she closed the door gently, and let the darkness come. Not with fear, but with quiet. And beyond the walls, the snow began to fall harder, quiet at first, then steady, then absolute. The world was changing. And inside that small wooden cabin, so was something else. Morning arrived cloaked in white. Snow blanketed the land like a burial shroud, untouched and endless, softening the sharp edges of fence posts and rooftops. The sky was pale silver, heavy with the threat of more. Caroline stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass. Her fingertips pressed against it lightly, as if testing the world outside for truth. Ruthie was still asleep, her small form curled beneath two thick quilts. She had spoken a few words the day before, just a simple observation about the chickens, but it had struck Caroline like thunder. The voice of her daughter, so long absent, returning in fragments. Hope didn't knock loudly. It crept in quiet, careful. Behind her, the low creak of floorboards marked Granger's entrance. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though unwilling to disturb the peace. He carried 2 cups of hot tea, steam coiling upward in lazy spirals. "You'll want these before we step outside," he said. Caroline accepted the cup with a quiet nod, her fingers brushing his. Their eyes met briefly. A silence passed between them, neither awkward nor prolonged, just full. The kind of silence that said more than words. "Snow buried the chicken coop," he added. "Roof's held, but we'll need to shovel paths to the barn before nightfall." "I'll help," she said without hesitation. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. Gratitude had settled in the space between them, unspoken but understood. The morning unfolded in crisp, breath-stealing cold. The snow clung to their boots, thick and reluctant to part. Caroline's muscles burned from the labor, but she welcomed it. The ache gave her back a sense of presence, of purpose. Beside her, Granger worked in silence, pausing only to offer instructions when necessary. The work was physical, but not isolating. With each shovel of snow, some small barrier between them gave way. By mid-afternoon, Ruthie emerged from the cabin, her cheeks rosy from the fire. She stood quietly at the edge of the porch, watching as her mother and Granger cleared a path toward the barn. Then, without a word, she stepped down and began dragging a small broom through the snow. Caroline looked up, startled. "Ruthie, your boots!" But Granger stopped her with a look. "Let her." They watched the child sweep, her motions awkward but determined. It was the first time Ruthie had acted on her own since the journey began. That evening, after the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky dimmed to deep cobalt, Granger brought out a box of tools and a bundle of fabric. He sat near the hearth, laying out scraps and thread. "What are you making?" Caroline asked, kneeling beside him. "Clothes," he said. "For Ruthie. I kept some of my boys' things. Figured I could repurpose what's still good." Caroline blinked back the sting in her eyes. "That's kind of you." He shrugged. "She deserves warmth." She picked up a piece of flannel, running her fingers over it thoughtfully. "I used to sew by lamplight while my husband read aloud. He said it made our little place feel civilized." Granger chuckled, a rare, low sound. "Never been called civilized in my life." "I wouldn't start now," she replied, teasing gently. They fell into an easy rhythm, cutting and folding, occasionally brushing hands in the cramped space. The air between them was shifting, gradually, like snow melting under sunlight. Neither of them named it, but both felt it settling in their bones. Later that night, after Ruthie had been tucked in and the fire reduced to a soft glow, Caroline remained seated on the rug, her back against the wall, legs pulled to her chest. Granger poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup and passed it to her. "I thought you didn't drink," she said. "I don't. Not when I'm alone." The fire popped in the silence that followed. Caroline took a slow sip, savoring the warmth as it slid down her throat. "My husband used to talk about you," she said finally. "Said you were the only man he trusted to watch his back when the bullets flew. He thought of you as a good man." "I was a different man then," Granger replied. His voice had changed, quieter, darker. She looked at him. His eyes were fixed on the flames, unblinking. "I held my boy in my arms while he coughed his life away. I dug the grave with frozen hands. My wife, she bled out while I begged her to hold on. I couldn't save them." He paused. The pain in his voice wasn't theatrical. It was buried deep, sharpened by years of solitude. "I came out here thinking I could outrun the world, build something with my own hands, far from everything. But land doesn't care if you're grieving. It just demands you get up every day and fight not to be swallowed." Caroline set her cup down. She didn't offer comfort. What could she say that would touch that kind of hurt? Instead, she moved closer, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I came here hoping someone would save us," she said, voice trembling. "But I think I just needed someone who understood what it means to lose everything." Granger turned toward her slowly. The flicker of firelight danced across his features, softening the lines of grief. "You're not the only one," he said. And for the first time since they met, Caroline smiled, small, almost hesitant, but real. That night, she didn't close the door to the back room. Granger lay near the hearth as usual, rifle within arm's reach, but his eyes lingered on the open doorway longer than they should have. Snow fell again before dawn, gentle this time, like a whisper rather than a warning. The world outside was still dangerous. Caroline knew that. Her husband's debt had not vanished, and their presence here was a question still unanswered. But something was beginning. Not safety. Not peace. Something rarer. Trust. And trust, she realized, was more powerful than any promise. Tomorrow would bring more work, more silence, perhaps even more danger. But tonight there was warmth in the walls. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like she belonged. Night came quickly that winter's eve, descending like a veil over the Montana plains. The quiet was too deep, the air too still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Caroline felt it in her chest, an unease that had no voice, only rhythm. She stood at the porch rail, eyes scanning the tree line. Ruthie slept inside, curled like a cat beneath hand-sewn quilt. Thomas was in the barn finishing the day's work, but even his steady presence could not erase the tension crawling under her skin. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement on the ridge. Not deer. Not wind. Too purposeful. Her pulse quickened. She stepped inside, pulled the rifle from above the hearth. Her hands shook, not from fear of the weapon, but from what she already knew. Someone was coming. Thomas returned minutes later, snow on his shoulders, lantern swinging at his side. "They're back," she said before he even stepped inside. He froze, eyes narrowing. "Who?" "The men. From the saloon. The ones that followed us on the trail." Thomas's jaw set like stone. "How many?" "3. Maybe more." He didn't curse. Didn't flinch. He merely closed the door behind him and bolted it. Then he crossed the room and placed his hand on the rifle still clutched in her grip. "I won't let them take her," she said, her voice low and trembling. "I know," he said. Outside, hoofbeats approached, slow, deliberate. A knock followed. Sharp. Calculated. Thomas opened the window beside the hearth, just enough to peer through the dark. Flames danced in the distance. Torches. One rider dismounted. His voice was cold and confident. "Thomas Granger, we know what you're harboring. She's got debts on her name. Ain't nothing personal, just good business." Thomas didn't answer. "You're a rational man. Hand over the girl and her mama, and we'll be on our way. Otherwise, well, a man can only fight so long alone." Caroline stepped beside him, her body taut as a drawn bow. "We can't stay inside." "No," he said. "They'll burn us out." "What do we do?" Thomas turned and looked at her, not past her, not around her, but directly into her. "We fight. Together." She nodded. He knelt beside the stove, pulling up a floorboard. Beneath it, a weathered box. Inside, 2 more rifles, a scatter of ammunition, and a Colt revolver. Caroline didn't ask questions. She loaded the rifle like she had on the trail, her fingers steady despite the pounding of her heart. Ruthie woke as the first torch hit the roof. Screams tore through the cold night air, men emboldened by numbers, flames, and greed. Thomas burst through the front door and fired a warning shot. One of the men fell, screaming. Another ducked behind the trough. Caroline pulled Ruthie into the root cellar behind the kitchen, wrapping her in thick blankets, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Stay here. No matter what. Don't come out until I call. Mama, I'll come back for you." Then she was gone, rifle in hand, breath clouding the night as she slid behind the barn, shadows her only cover. Gunfire cracked across the field. Thomas moved like a ghost, reloading, repositioning, striking hard. He knew the land, knew its creaks and shadows. But the men kept coming. From behind the well, Caroline took aim and fired. A man fell. Another turned and saw her, charging. She fired again, missed. He reached her, knocked the rifle from her grip. They struggled. She clawed at his face, but he was stronger, crueler. Just as he drew a blade, another shot rang out, close. The man crumpled. Granger stood feet away, panting, smoke curling from the end of his revolver. "You all right?" She nodded, breathless. But the fire had spread, licking the edge of the barn, crackling up the dry wood. Horses screamed inside. Granger ran toward the structure, ignoring the gunfire. Caroline followed, dragging water buckets as fast as she could. Inside, the air was thick and bitter. Flames danced above, licking the rafters. Granger opened stall doors, slapping the horses to get them out. One bucked past him, singeing its mane. A rafter groaned overhead. "Thomas, get out!" she screamed. But he didn't move. One Colt remained, panicked, refusing to budge. Then, as Caroline lunged toward him, the roof gave way. Flames and smoke and screaming wood. She froze. "Thomas!" Silence. The fire roared louder, and then a figure emerged. Blackened, coughing, eyes wild. He stumbled through the smoke, arms around the Colt's neck, guiding it forward. Caroline ran to him, threw her arms around his shoulders. His coat was scorched, hair singed. But he was alive. "You stupid, stubborn man," she whispered. He coughed, then gave a weak smile. "Told you I wasn't civilized." Together, they watched the barn collapse into flames. When the final gunshot rang out, it was Red Hawk who emerged from the trees, bloodied but upright, dragging the last of the intruders by the collar. "I heard their talk at the trading post," he said simply. "Figured I'd lend a hand." Thomas nodded, solemn. "You saved our lives." Red Hawk met Caroline's eyes. "You've got strength, white woman. But even strength needs allies." She bowed her head, grateful beyond words. By sunrise, the fire was out. The dead had been laid in the snow. The land was quiet again, scarred but still standing. Caroline found Ruthie in the cellar, her small face tear-streaked and brave. "It's over," she whispered. "We're safe." That afternoon, Caroline stood with Thomas near the remnants of the barn. He was shirtless beneath a blanket, tending his burns with stoic indifference. She dabbed a wet cloth across his shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly. "You should have let me go in," she said. "And let you get crushed under that roof? Not a chance. I can fight, you know." "I know. I saw." They were quiet a moment. Then she spoke. "I've been running since the day he died. Every town, every face, just trying to keep Ruthie alive. But I'm tired of running." "You don't have to," Thomas said. "Not anymore." She met his eyes, searching. "I don't want to be just a guest here," she said. "I want to build something again. For Ruthie. For me. He stepped closer, his voice low. Then stay. Build it with me. Their kiss was slow, hesitant, like spring after a brutal winter. Not fiery, just real. Grounded. Earned. That night, as wind sighed across the fields and the ashes of the barn cooled to silence, Caroline sat on the porch with Thomas and Ruthie nestled between them. Her small head leaned against his chest, eyes closed, safe. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Some wounds didn't need words. They whispered through glances, through the steady beat of survival, through shared hands rebuilding broken things. And on that land, scarred by flame and grief and memory, something began to grow again. Not just a home, but love, quiet, tested, true. And for the first time in a long, long while, they all belonged. If this story moved you, if you felt the fire, the fear, the hope, and the quiet power of love rising from ashes, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts below. What would you have done in Caroline's boots? And if you believe in second chances and finding home in the unlikeliest places, stay with us for more stories from the untamed heart of the Wild West.